Great. So today we have Professor Sam Usher with us. Sam is currently a faculty at Department of International Economics, Johns Hopkins University. And he's also affiliated with CID at Harvard and CPR at New Delhi. Now, I mean, if you look at Sam's website, you will see that he has produced a series of excellent and rigorous papers, which sort of, based on combining several administrative data sets, remote sensing data sets of high resolution. And they analyze fairly very important questions in economics. And today's paper, the long run development impacts of agricultural productivity gains is again sort of, in the same vein, an excellent paper. What is actually one needs to mention is that he and his co-authors have made a lot of these data available for all of us as well. And I think today Sam is going to take some time to speak about it as well. So without much further ado, let me hand it over to Sam. So we have around 45 minutes to an hour. And then, and also as Sam mentioned, you can ask questions in the middle as well. So Sam, it's over to you.
All right, thanks so much, Ambrish, for that very generous introduction, and it's really nice to be here. As was mentioned, I'll be presenting this new research of ours on understanding the impacts of India's irrigation canals, and through this, trying to understand something about the relationship between the agricultural and non-agricultural parts of the economy and what we should expect from ideas around agricultural-led development, but I'll also take a little time to talk about our open data work, which is an increasingly large part of what I and my co-authors are focusing on. So this is joint work with Ali Campion, who's a terrific research assistant with us at Development Data Lab, an organization that I started a couple of years ago. That
sorry, Sam, just sorry to bother you. So
okay.
From the list of participants, I gather that many of the students might not be from economics. So just sort of keep that in mind.
Okay. Oh, that's great to know. My background actually, so I did undergraduate in political philosophy, and with a sort of minor in a way in political science, and only came to economics pretty late in the game after living in India for a few years and working with the Poverty Action Lab. So I'm always very happy to talk to people from other disciplines. I think that's an important part of what we do. We should do more of it, and I will try to remove as much econ jargon as possible from this talk. When I fail at that objective, please feel free to interrupt me and ask questions. So yeah, so this is joint work with Ali Campion, who's with us at Development Data Lab, Doug Gollin, who's at the University of Oxford, and then my longtime collaborator, Paul Novosad, who is now an associate professor of economics at Dartmouth College. And by the way, I keep seeing like people entering the waiting room, but I don't need to be admitting them, right? Someone else is managing admissions to this virtual room, I assume. Okay, so the overview on this project is that irrigation canals are these absolutely massive investments that, at least in theory, serve half of India's rural population. If you look at a map of India and you see all the areas that are supposed to be served by these major and medium irrigation canals, it covers basically half of the villages in India, of the 600,000 villages in India. Now, most of India's irrigation canals were constructed at least 40 years ago, many of them, many more, many under the British Raj, under the princely states, and in the early decades of independence. Not as many have been constructed more recently, but there are still some. And we see studying these canals as an opportunity to learn not just about the impacts of canals, that's useful to know for the people who work on canals, but as a way of getting some traction on a longstanding set of questions in development economics about the role of agricultural productivity gains in the broader development process, and what we should expect for growth in the wider economy on the back of investments made in agricultural productivity. Now, the challenge with evaluating the impact of canals is much like evaluating the impact of a lot of other infrastructure, and I've done some work on roads and other infrastructure. The challenge is that placement is what we call endogenous. And what that means is that canals aren't just randomly built according to some arbitrary flip of a coin, but instead they're built in the places that have high agricultural productivity potential, or in the places that have a lot of political favor, and therefore a lot of other infrastructure is built there. Or there may be a whole bunch of other reasons why they're built. Sometimes maybe it's in response to a famine or a drought. And so actually they're built in poorer than average places. All of these things are possible, but all of these things make it difficult to assess the impact of canals, because when you compare the areas that are served by canals to those that are not served by canals, they differ for many reasons, not just because of whatever the impacts are of canal irrigation itself. And so what we're going to do here is we have a couple of different ideas for how to go about assessing the actual causal impact of these canals. And the main one that we're going to use is exploiting the fact that canal water flows downhill, as with all water. And that means that villages that are close to canals but have slight differences in elevation have very different access to canal water. Villages that are near canals but slightly below the canal in elevation are going to get access to the canal water. Villages that are slightly higher elevation than the canals are not going to get as much access to the canal water. And that's going to create a discontinuity that we can use to identify these causal impacts of canal irrigation on first agricultural outcomes and then on a range of non-agricultural outcomes. So let me give a quick history of these canals in India. For this audience, I probably have to give it less than I do to most audiences I speak to these days. So because India faces very high variance of rainfall, irrigation is really critical to agricultural productivity throughout the subcontinent. And when the British were in India, they invested very heavily in canal infrastructure, particularly during the 19th century. And actually, much of it was privately financed. Companies would build these canals. This is actually how a lot of canals got built in the US and in England and other places. Private companies would be founded to operate a canal. They would raise money on private financial markets by selling bonds or issuing equity, and then use it to make the very large investments in building these canals. Between 1893 and 1903, during just that decade, the total land irrigated by canals in India increased by 50%. Tushar Shah is who I'm citing here. He's done much of the really terrific work on canals and other forms of irrigation in India. And it's from one of his papers on the bottom right that you can see here that basically canals, the dotted line, were the dominant form of irrigation in India for a very long time, up until about the 60s and then 70s, when groundwater took over as the major form. Basically, technology advanced to the point where pumps could pump a lot of water out of the ground, and that was a better way of getting water to a lot of fields in India over the canals. But the fact is that they're still a very big deal, and they still irrigate massive swaths of India, maybe about 10% of the land in India, according to more recent surveys. So what are the long run impacts of improved agricultural productivity? What do we know about this already? This is a very old idea in development economics and in development policymaking. This is in sort of academic economic circles, often referred to as the Johnston-Miller hypothesis, where they basically argued that improving agricultural productivity has all of these positive spillover effects into other sectors of the economy. It creates demand for non-agricultural sectors. You know, if you're a subsistence farmer, you have no cash to buy shoes, but once you start growing enough, then you have demand for shoes and TVs and motorbikes and whatever else. It also frees up labor. You know, the people who do non-agricultural activities have to have something to eat. It creates surplus capital that can be invested in these other sectors. So this is a long-standing idea that agricultural productivity growth is going to generate growth in these other sectors of the economy. This really nice theory paper in 1992 by Matsuyama argued that actually it really depends on whether the economy is open or closed. Basically, whether the economy is trading with the outside world or not. So think of England at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. They needed to increase their agricultural productivity enough that they could feed the people who were doing non-agricultural activities. But if you're a village in modern India or anywhere else trading with the outside world, you don't need to grow a whole lot of food before you start doing, say, manufacturing. You just need to be productive in manufacturing, and then you can start doing these other activities. There's some recent work by my co-author Doug and others showing that the Green Revolution around the world actually really did lead to increased GDP, including in other sectors of the economy. And there's some work in Brazil that argues that basically the impacts of agriculture on other sectors in the economy are really going to depend on the agricultural productivity gains on other sectors of the economy are really going to depend on the nature of those gains. And if those gains come in the form of certain technologies that free up labor, say through mechanization, then that might free up a bunch of labor to then work in other sectors. On the other hand, if those productivity gains are very labor intensive, and in the case of Brazil, they study opening up a second growing season for maize, that can actually crowd out other sectors of the economy because it's drawing more land and more people into agriculture and away from other things. So I promised I would talk some about our open data initiatives, and really this is the one slide to do it, but let me spend a few minutes talking about what we're up to here. So Paul and I started working together in grad school. We were PhD classmates many years ago at this point. And we started, this was at a time when a lot of people were doing a lot of randomized control trials. We were studying in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and most of the PhD students at Harvard and MIT who were working in development were doing RCTs. We were particularly interested in the massive amounts of new big data that were becoming available, but often not being used very effectively for either research and development or for policymaking. And so we started collecting a lot of data covering every village and town in India for our research. And so we wrote a series of papers on rural roads, on the mining sector in India, on the impacts on local economies of political representation by the ruling party, and trying to understand political favoritism and how that translates into economic growth, and other papers besides these. And for each of our papers, we kept adding more data to this collection that we were building. So after a number of years, we had data covering all of India's 600,000 villages, all of India's now 8,000 towns. And we had information from the economic census on firms. We had information on the population census from on demographics and local amenities. Satellite imagery told us about deforestation and agricultural productivity. The socioeconomic and caste census gives all kinds of information on all sorts of different things, but including an estimate of consumption. And we realized that this was both very useful for our research, but that there was a lot of demand out there for this. And we started getting increasingly interested in actually making an open data platform out of the data that had sort of accumulated almost by accident through the process of doing research on these different things. And so when I left the World Bank a couple of years ago and came back to teaching in academia, we started the Development Data Lab. And this is one part our sort of research shop through which we run a lot of our projects for research, but then it's also really dedicated to open data and open science with a particular focus on India and on high resolution data. And so we launched the SHRUG, the Socioeconomic High Resolution Rural Urban Geographic Data Platform, or panel for India. And this has data now on 30 years of data covering a very wide range of different variables for every village and town in India. And now we're working on even adding neighborhood level data to it. And we recently released version 1.5, which is called Samosa. We have my partner Radhika to thank for all of the different snack names that we're going to be using for the SHRUG. Many more to come. And we're currently working on SHRUG 2.0, which we hope is even more useful than this. It's already been downloaded over 5,000 times. It seems like a lot of different research teams are using it. We have pretty grand ambitions for it to be much more useful for both researchers, but also for policymakers. And really the philosophy behind all of this is that knowledge, as we say in economics, knowledge is non-rival, which means that I can use an idea and that doesn't prevent you from using that same idea. I can read a paper and that doesn't stop you from reading that same paper, which is unlike physical goods like apples, where if I eat it, you can't. But here, what we really believe in is that like data is a form of knowledge and therefore is also non-rival. And so investments that are made in data should be made once. And unfortunately, that's not the way the world mostly works. A lot of the time, the people who produce data, whether it's the government or corporations or others or researchers, produce some really, really interesting, useful data, and then they sit on it and other people can't use it. And that's sometimes because it takes investments for them to make it available to others, sometimes because they don't want to share it, they don't want to lose their competitive advantage. Bureaucrats don't want to look bad by releasing the data that has been collected under their management and has lots of holes in it, or reveals problems with the programs they're overseeing, or whatever it is. So there are lots of reasons why people don't do this, but we're hoping that we can kind of contribute to this growing movement, somewhat akin to the open software movement, that really promotes open data and basically allows everybody to benefit from the investments that are made. And in particular, our vision here is that there's a ton of data that's out there that has been very costly to generate. Take the socioeconomic and caste census, very costly for the government to generate, but the government kind of didn't take the final step of making it very useful or available to people. And so if we can make what are, for us, large investments, but are in the grand scheme of things are relatively small investments, to make all of these really rich data sources really widely available and linkable to many other data sets, then we think we're doing some real good for the world. And hopefully this will make data much more readily available for civil society organizations, for researchers, for newspapers. We're exploring a partnership with the Hindustan Times right now, as well as for policymakers. And we're in the process, we're advising Niti Aayog on a new data platform that they're trying to develop along some of these lines. I'm talking to some IAS officers who might be interested in sort of using these kinds of data for their policy making. If you guys know about other people who would kind of be interested in this, please tell them about it and please put us in touch. And please do use it for your own research. We're always really happy to hear when people are putting these data sets to new uses to work on new problems that we either don't think of or just don't have the time to work on. Okay, so what do we need to do for this particular project? And let me just keep an eye on the time. And I should also apologize, it's 11:20 here at night, and I usually, and I have lots of calls to India in the mornings, so my days are quite long, and I'm a little tired here. Okay, so this project, like many of our other projects, requires a ton of data. And in this case, we have to combine a very wide range of different data sets, but as I've mentioned, luckily, we've already combined a bunch of these for earlier projects. So to examine agriculture, we need to measure agricultural productivity. Unfortunately, in India, there is no publicly available, directly observed data on agricultural productivity at the village level. So what we do is we use satellite imagery. We use these vegetative indices, NDVI and EVI, and we further process them to get our best estimates at the village level of agricultural productivity for each growing season. So we can get an estimate for every village of Kharif agricultural productivity and of Rabi agricultural productivity. We also have data from the cost of cultivation survey, which is a bit more detailed, but for many fewer villages. The population census tells us what are the 3 major crops grown in every village. So we can look at cropping patterns and whether people are changing their cropping choices when they have access to canal water. We have access to an ownership of mechanized farm equipment and irrigation equipment from the socioeconomic caste census, and this potential productivity from the FAO GAEZ. When it comes to measuring irrigation itself, unfortunately, India, and this is actually one of the few areas where Pakistan has much better data than India, India doesn't have comprehensive data on the water that flows through its canals. In fact, even if you go into the state level, they often don't have much data on how much water is flowing through different parts of their canal networks. There are some exceptions like Andhra Pradesh, but so we have no real way of knowing exactly how much water is flowing through these canals. But we do have GIS data on the entire canal networks, and we know the command areas, which are the areas that they ostensibly serve. The population census does ask for every village the acreage of land that's served by canal irrigation and other forms of irrigation. We also have the minor irrigation census, which unfortunately isn't very useful because it doesn't cover major irrigation like these canals. And then we also we spent a lot of time collecting data on the dates of construction for all of these canals that we're studying. To look at poverty and welfare measures, we have from the population census a series of different assets. And then in the SECC microdata, we have all of these assets, and as well as a very poorly constructed variable on the earnings of the highest earning member of the household in 3 broad categories. And what we do is we put all of that together using a methodology called small area estimation, which basically combines all the different assets and gives us our best guess of the consumption per capita for every household in the country. And then we have a whole bunch of GIS data on elevation, on village polygons, we have groundwater readings, and so on. Okay, so what are our major results? Since I'll shortly run out of time here, since we only have an hour, our major results are the following. More access to canal irrigation does lead to a bunch of gains in agriculture. We find there's more land under cultivation when villages are benefiting from canal water. We find that there's a higher share of that land is irrigated. We find more mechanization, and we find more agricultural productivity, specifically during the Rabi season. And we think that this makes a lot of sense because during Kharif, there's a ton of rain and the canals generally aren't really releasing water from the reservoirs. It's during the drier winter growing season that the canals are delivering water to villages that don't have enough. So we see a whole bunch of gains to agriculture, which is good, but we consider this the first stage. That's sort of obvious. Well, these are built in order to benefit agriculture, so no shit. But the real question of this paper is, do those big gains in agricultural productivity spill over into the rest of the economy, into higher living standards and into greater activity in other sectors? And so we can measure that across a wide range of different variables. And what we observe is basically the villages that do get canal water, they show increased population density. So they have more people per acre. They have higher levels of education. They have, by some specifications, more non-farm jobs per capita. And they have higher living standards. They have higher overall consumption, as we kind of predict it from these assets. But very critically, there's absolutely no impact on manufacturing. So this hypothesis that all this agricultural productivity gain is going to spill over into growth of other tradable sectors in the economy that can be the basis for longer run economic growth, it's not happening. So there are somewhat marginal gains to consumption. There are people do have slightly higher living standards. There are more people in these places, but those other sectors of the economy that the sort of optimistic preachers of agriculture-led development have predicted, it doesn't seem to be the case, at least in this context. Okay, so as I said already, the challenge in this paper and the challenge in many other papers like this is, how do you estimate the impact of things that are endogenously placed? When placement is not random, the differences that we observe between the places that have canals and the places that don't are due to canals, but are also due to a bunch of other factors, including things that we can't even anticipate. And so what we need to do is find a natural experiment that basically provides as good as random variation. So in a perfect world, from the standpoint of a researcher, the government of India would come to me and say, hey, Sam, we're building 1,000 new canals. Where should we put them? And I would say, well, we can really learn a lot from this if you allow me to randomize where they go. And then I'll just randomly flip a coin and say, does this village get a canal or not? Yes, no. And then if I'm flipping a coin, then I know that there are no differences on average between the villages that get canals and the villages that don't. And then after a decade, when we look at economic outcomes, I can attribute any of those differences between canal villages and non-canal villages to the canals themselves and not to other things. But no government is crazy enough to give me or any other economist the power to randomize something like big infrastructure. And so we need what's called a natural experiment. And so for that, we're going to take advantage of these differences in elevation, and hopefully I can convince you that this is a logical way to go about it. I should mention that right now, all of our outcomes are going to be in basically 2011 from the population census, 2012 from the SECC, 2013 from the economic census. But what we'd really like to be able to do is see the various outcomes in these villages before the canals ever came in, to be able to say, yeah, they looked the same, the villages that we're calling treatment villages and the villages that we're calling control villages. And we're currently working on that by digitizing the 1951 census. So we're going to have village level data from the 1951 census, the first census after independence, that was done in all parts of the country in a consistent way. And we'll be publishing that on the SHRUG as well. So that historical data, we hope, will be really useful for people studying long run growth in rural areas. But but that's not ready quite yet. It's a bit of a nightmare getting this data out of all of these handbooks. So here's the basic idea in visual form. And I should warn you, no one will ever mistake me for an artist. So here are two villages near each other, but one of them is slightly up the hill, one of them is slightly down the hill. And we assume that they have similar starting points, but then a canal that runs between them gets built at some point. Now, the village that's downhill from the canal can get water from it. The villages uphill from the canal cannot. So what happens? Well, agricultural productivity goes up in the village downhill. It doesn't go up by as much in the village uphill. And the theory that we're trying to test, the null hypothesis, is that agricultural productivity gain in the village downhill ends up translating into more factories, higher living standards, more education, better economic outcomes overall. Was there someone with a question? No. Okay.
There is no question so far.
Okay. So the strategy that we're going to use here is just formalizing what I just described, what I just showed in those pictures. So we're saying, look, because water flows downhill, villages that are just below the canal are going to get it. Villages that are just uphill, it's not that they can't get any canal water. Maybe they can pump a little bit. Maybe the canal is recharging the groundwater table and they can pump up water from the groundwater table. But basically, the elevation of the canal is generating a discontinuity in agricultural productivity that we can take advantage of. And so we do this in what's called a regression discontinuity design. And a regression discontinuity design has to have a running variable, which is continuous. In this case, it's relative elevation. So it's the village elevation minus the canal elevation. And so at 0, when the village and the canal are at exactly the same elevation, we're going to get this discontinuity. If you go to just 1 meter above the canal, you're getting a whole lot less water than 1 meter below the canal. And so that it's going to be that discontinuous jump that is going to be the source of our quasi-experimental variation. How do we measure the elevation of the village? Well, it's not worth getting into too much, but we basically take the 5th percentile of elevation in the village. We find that kind of generates the biggest jump in canal irrigation at the discontinuity, at the 0 point. We also have a different strategy, similar in spirit, that's taking advantage of these command area boundaries. So we know the limits of the area served by all of these canals, and so we can compare villages just inside these areas that get the canal water to just outside that aren't supposed to get the canal water, and comparing those, we can do something very similar. So given sort of that we're halfway through, let me just say we're going to define the analysis sample here as villages that are relatively close to a canal. Here we say 25 kilometers, and that are somewhat close in elevation to the canal, so within 50 meters up or downhill from their nearest canal. We're only going to keep villages in subdistricts where we have both treatment and control villages, where there are villages that are getting served by these canals and villages that are above them in elevation and we think not getting served, but also where we observe that the basic geography of these uphill and downhill villages are relatively similar. Because we don't want to compare, villages in a nice flat fertile valley to the villages in the hills nearby. Those are different villages geologically, those are different villages topologically, and probably ethnically, and in all kinds of different ways, not because of the canals, but because of their starting economic and geographic conditions. So we're going to keep just the areas where the villages look really similar, where they're both kind of flat or both kind of hilly on both uphill and downhill from the canals. We're also going to drop the villages right at the boundary. So when villages are have exactly the same elevation as the canal, we don't know whether to kind of put them in the treatment group or the control group. And so we're going to drop the villages within just a couple of meters of elevation of the canal on either side. It doesn't really make much of a difference, but it cleans up our analysis a little bit. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is test for balance. And we test for balance because we want to ensure that the villages, sort of by whatever we can measure, are kind of the same just uphill and just downhill from the canal. As I said before, ideally, we'd be looking at a bunch of outcomes in the 1951 census before all these canals were built, or before many of these canals were built. We can't do that because we don't have that data quite yet. And so, but we can't look at economic outcomes in, say, 2011 for balance, because those are exactly the things that could be affected by the canals. So we're going to look at a bunch of sort of geographic fundamentals. And the geographic fundamentals are ruggedness. Ruggedness is basically how much does elevation change in your village. You have ruggedness of 0 if everything's totally flat. You know, you have like basically infinite ruggedness if you're on a cliff. But it's measuring how hilly basically is your village. And so you can see here is that after we do these sample restrictions for our analysis, ruggedness is balanced. There's no statistically significant difference between being above and below the canal and ruggedness. Likewise for distance to the nearest river, average rainfall, distance to the nearest town of 10,000, or distance to the nearest town of at least 50,000. So we don't find any statistically significant differences here, and that's reassuring that the differences that we do observe in 2011, 12, 13, after many decades of having canals, are truly the result of the canals and not because of other factors. So our empirical specification, we're interested in this beta 1 coefficient, which is the coefficient on this dummy variable that takes on the variable 1 if the village is below the elevation of the canal. And so we're going to regress a whole series of y variables, of agricultural variables, of irrigation variables, of living standards, of variables from the economic census on firms, to try to see what varies when you cross this threshold from being just above the canal to just below. We control linearly for elevation both above and below the canal. We also just throw in a ruggedness control to be safe, that we're taking out any of the sort of variation that's explained by basic topological features, as well as having a subdistrict fixed effect to make sure that we're always comparing nearby villages that we think should otherwise be the same, except for this access to canal water. We do a very similar thing for this command area specification, but I don't really have much of the time to get into it. We're using it in the way we're writing the paper right now. It's more of a robustness check. Okay, so let's first take a look at agricultural outcomes. So we look at a range of different agricultural outcomes. We look at extensification. This means, are people growing on more land? Are they pulling more marginal land into agriculture? We look at irrigation. We can see the share of agricultural land in a village that's irrigated by any method, that's irrigated by canals, that's irrigated by tube wells. We're interested in crop choice. Are villages growing different crops when they start getting access to this water? And in particular, we're going to look at the number of water intensive crops. So we define water intensive crops as cotton, sugarcane, and paddy, and see whether those show up in the top 3 crops grown in each village according to the census. Then we're going to measure, as I said, agricultural productivity. The way we do this, so there's a huge literature out there in remote sensing that is trying to get as much information out of satellite imagery as possible. And there are many, many different ways that very talented remote sensing experts and agronomists go about trying to estimate crop yields. Ours is not terribly sophisticated, but we think is a kind of good basic measure for using across all of India, across many different crops. And the way we do this is we say, look, during each growing season, a village is going to start with a certain amount of greenness, a certain amount of biomass from all the forested areas, and other places where you're basically not growing crops. So there's a certain starting amount, and then you plant stuff, and that grows over the course of the season. And then it reaches its peak right before harvest, right before you cut down all the maize or the wheat or whatever. And so we're going to measure agricultural productivity by taking a difference within each growing season of the growing season peak vegetative index minus the beginning of the growing season index. And that's basically how much biomass was added over the course of the season. And that's a proxy for overall agricultural output. And so we do this for both Kharif and Rabi seasons because we precisely know that like the canals are basically delivering water during Rabi and not during Kharif. And finally, we can look at mechanized share of the households that are owning mechanized farm equipment to see whether agriculture is getting more mechanized, more advanced. So here you can see it these are the sort of favored graphs by people running regression discontinuities to see that there actually is a jump exactly where we expect there to be a jump, which is at the 0 line. And so just focus on the figure on the left, which is using this relative elevation. So villages on the left are those that are above the canal, that have positive elevation relative to the canal, and those that are on the right have negative elevation relative to the canal. So those are the ones that we think are getting canal water. And what you can see is that right at 0, there's a really big jump up in the share of the village land that's actually being irrigated by canals. So exactly as we predict, the villages that are just a little bit below the canal are getting access to a lot more canal water, or irrigating a lot more of their land with canal water. So the size of, let me just say that the size of that jump at 0 is basically the estimated coefficient. How much more does a village benefit from a canal or grow more crops or whatever it is when they're just below versus just above the canal? So what we're going to show here is what's called a coefficient plot, which plots the coefficients from a series of different regressions, looking at the estimated impact of going from just above the canal to just below the canal on a whole series of different outcomes. And what do we find? Well, we find that generally speaking, agricultural outcomes go up quite a bit. We find that villages are more likely to grow water-intensive crops. We find that there's more agricultural land overall. There's more irrigated land in total. That's driven by a larger increase in canal irrigated area. We find an insignificant but negative effect on tube well irrigated area. So people are using less wells, pumping up less water from the ground when they have access to canal water. We find no difference in Kharif agricultural productivity, but we do in Rabi agricultural productivity. As we said, that's exactly what we kind of expected to find. So agriculture gets a lot better when you get access to these canals. Great. That's our first stage. That's what we want to confirm. And now we can move on to what I think are the more interesting outcomes, testing this hypothesis of agriculture-led development. So now we're going to look at a range of non-farm outcomes. We look at population density. Are these villages supporting more people overall? This is going to be the log of population per square kilometer. We look at population density rather than total population in these villages, because one of the things that we noticed is that when villages are benefiting from canals, they start getting carved up into smaller villages. And so we don't want to be comparing big villages above canals to small villages below them. That's sort of arbitrary where you're drawing the lines between villages. So we just, we want to know density in terms of overall people per square kilometer. We look at consumption, and this is defined as the log of this per capita consumption estimate that we're imputing from the socioeconomic and caste census using these small area estimation methods. And then what we really want to do is look at non-farm economic activity. We want to know, is there growth in the service sector? Is there growth in the manufacturing sector? Are more people doing non-agricultural activities? Is this process of structural transformation, of moving out of agriculture, starting to happen on the back of this canal irrigation and the higher agricultural productivity that it brings? So here's what we find. We find pretty big jumps up in population density. On average, consumption is higher. People are a bit better off in the villages that are getting canal water, but we're really not finding much on total non-farm employment. We find kind of marginally significant effects on services. I think this makes sense. There would be small but positive effects on services since people are now better off in these villages. So there might be a couple more people working in shops or restaurants or cutting hair or doing all of these things that basically serve people who have a little bit of money to spend. But really we're finding nothing in manufacturing. Okay, and this includes in agro-processing. So this higher agricultural surplus that's being generated really isn't leading to more economic activity in other sectors, other tradable sectors of the economy. Well, maybe a little bit in sectors that are serving just local consumption, but not in sectors that are selling goods outside of these villages. We also look in human capital investments. We want to know, like, are these canals benefiting villages by helping households invest more in their children. We'd love to be able to measure health. We can't in these surveys. This is a general challenge in a lot of my work is we have this incredibly rich data, it covers the whole country. You know, the socioeconomic caste census is supposed to be every person, the economic census is every firm, but whenever there's censuses, they're not going to ask very many questions. And so we really have to find ways of making the most out of these surveys that ask very few questions. The SECC asks about 20 questions, but they do ask about education. And so we can look at the percent of the population that has achieved each education level, at least primary school, at least middle school, at least secondary school, as well as from the population census from a different survey, the share of the population that's illiterate. And we can use that to validate the results that we find from the SECC. So what do we find here? We find that basically across all of our educational variables, we see these increases in educational attainment. So some of this newfound wealth is actually going into higher levels of education. We also look at infrastructure. We're kind of interested in this question of like, do these canals have bigger effects in the presence of certain complementary infrastructure? And so what you can see here is we're splitting on sub-districts that have above average agricultural power, like electricity for agriculture, or below average. In panel B, like above average road density or below average. And what we actually find is not very big differences on the basis of infrastructure. If you really squint, maybe here or there, you see that there might be some differences. It looks like the consumption effects of canals are a little bit bigger in the areas that have more electricity for agriculture as opposed to those that have less electricity for agriculture. You know, for road density, you know, slightly bigger effects on population density and on consumption for the areas that have more roads as opposed to the areas that don't. But these differences are not statistically significant. I don't have a whole lot of confidence in them. So far, we haven't learned a whole lot about this interaction of canals with other forms of infrastructure. We also look at distance to nearest town. We're sort of interested in, like, remember I mentioned earlier on in this presentation that the theoretical work done on this suggests that there are going to be very different effects of agricultural productivity based on how open your economy is. So if you're in a really remote village that's not very well connected to outside markets, then increasing agricultural productivity might create that demand for more non-agricultural activities. And it facilitate this process of structural change. On the other hand, if you're close to towns and well integrated into outside markets, what sectors you're in should have to do with your comparative advantage and not whether your agricultural productivity has gone up by a bit. And so what you can see here is for the villages that are closer on average to town, we do find some higher results. We find that basically these canals seem to have more agricultural effects. The effects they have on rubby productivity are higher. The effects on water intensive crops, the effects on population density seem to be higher. But in a bunch of different economic outcomes, including consumption, they don't actually seem to be a lot higher. So maybe there's something about how well integrated you are into outside markets based on how far you are from towns, but again, not super conclusive evidence, in part because the effects of the canals on agriculture are bigger. And so we're mostly learning that, you know, for whatever reason, canals are benefiting agriculture more in these rural areas proximate to urban areas, more than we're learning about the impacts of agricultural productivity gains on non-agricultural activity in near versus far areas. Okay, let's do a little discussion in the, well, we have a bit of time actually. So we're seeing that canals are having these positive effects on agricultural productivity, seeing it translating into more population. We're seeing it translate a bit into higher living standards, into education. Does that mean that increased agricultural productivity is fueling local economic growth? Well, not necessarily, because we're really not seeing these gains in manufacturing. So likely the sort of gains from canals are limited to the direct effects of agriculture on people working in agriculture, but it's not kickstarting that broader process of structural change and economic growth that a lot of people have hoped for. We do find maybe that they have bigger effects in these areas close to towns, but it's mostly bigger agricultural effects and not really bigger non-agricultural effects. It may also be that the raises in living standards that we are observing are kind of coming mostly through this educational channel and not necessarily through like agriculture spilling into other sectors. But let me show you a little bit of ongoing evidence for some other hypotheses that we have here and are interested in. So one thing we want to know is what's happening to land holdings. We're seeing gains in population density. What exactly is that looking like on the ground? Is that you have a bunch more landless people? Is it that land holdings are being carved up into smaller pieces as you can now, with higher agricultural productivity, support a family on a smaller piece of land? We can't, unfortunately, observe migration. What we'd love to be able to see is the canals are built. What's happening to migration? Are people, is there less out migration to the urban areas once the canals are increasing agricultural productivity? Is there some in-migration from neighboring areas moving into the places that have higher agricultural productivity? We can't really see that. And so the population density is the best measure that we have of that overall process. So what we find here is that the share of landowners goes down. That is consistent with this increase in overall population. A bunch of those people don't have land. Well, interestingly, really, really striking, what we find is that the gains in living standards that we observe are really driven by the landless more than the landed. And this we found a really surprising result, because basically we expected that the landowners who own a bunch of the land, this is a fixed input into production. Now that the productivity of the sector has gone up, they should be accruing some of these benefits. And we're still trying to figure out why they're not. But we do see that the landless consumption has gone up by quite a bit. And what we basically hypothesize is that there's a spatial equilibrium. This is sort of a core concept in urban economics, which says that people move across space to wherever they're going to be best off. And so when agricultural productivity goes up, demand for agricultural labor goes up. In the short run, before people start moving, that's going to increase wages of the people who are the agricultural laborers, who are, we think, often landless. But then, so the landowners have to pay higher wages to the landless. But then over time, more and more landless people move in, and they push down the wage. They sort of compete away those gains. And so what we might be observing here is this sort of incomplete spatial equilibrium. And this is consistent with a bunch of research in India that suggests that people in India face, in general, particularly the less well-educated, face very, very high costs of moving across space. It's not easy for me to pick up and move from my village in Bihar to, Bombay, where they're paying higher wages. Obviously, a lot of people do, but a lot of people don't because they face various costs. And so maybe what's happening here, and we might think it's particularly severe moving from one rural area to another, is that people aren't sort of fully arbitraging away the wage gains that are taking place in these canal villages. This I don't have any evidence on. We will very, very soon. I'm literally digging into this data code on this tomorrow. But we're really interested, since we're interested in this process of structural transformation, and I'm saying it's not happening in the villages themselves, it's still possible that it's happening. So, we expected that there might be some manufacturing growth in these villages themselves. We're not observing that. That's interesting. But it might be that actually structural change is happening. It's just not happening precisely in the canal villages. It might be that it's happening somewhere nearby. It might be that it's happening in the nearby market towns, the sub-district town, or the place where agricultural trading takes place, or the place where if you're going to start a factory in the region, you're probably going to put it in the town and not in some village, even if that village is served by a canal. And so we've put together data on every town in India going back to 1911 with their populations. The population census is very nice to provide this. And we can basically, what we're going to do is use a different strategy to do this in the panel and look at what happens to urban areas or proto-urban areas when canals get built in their surrounding area. So, picture a catchment area of a town, say a 20-kilometer circle away from a town. When canals get built in that 20-kilometer range, do we see the town populations start to grow faster than otherwise similar towns that aren't getting canals at that time, or that are getting canals later on. So we'll have that evidence for you very soon. This is, I think, one of the big missing pieces of the puzzle here. It may very well be that structural change is happening, but just not in the villages themselves. Okay. I think I've said a lot of this, so let me just conclude, and then maybe we can take a few minutes for questions. So what we're doing in this paper is trying to see whether access to canal irrigation does in fact lead to not only agricultural productivity gains, but into a broader process of structural change, movement into new industries, increase in wages, and so on. What we find is that access to canal irrigation does in fact increase overall irrigation. It does increase agricultural productivity precisely in the drier season. It also increases education and consumption as far as we can measure it, but it does not lead to the kind of increased non-farm employment that is predicted by proponents of agriculture-led development, suggesting that at least at the very local level, greatly increasing agricultural productivity may not be much of a strategy for long-run growth. It's not a bad thing. These villages are supporting more people. Consumption levels seem to be slightly higher. I'm certainly not suggesting that like canals are bad or that irrigation is not a good thing. It just doesn't seem to be a strategy for long-run growth by facilitating movement into faster growing sectors of the economy. We do see a little bit of evidence maybe of complementary factors. We're still in the process of investigating this, trying to understand better how canals depend on transport infrastructure, on energy, and so on to mediate their effects. But the next steps we're doing are three things in particular. One is this idea of spatial equilibrium that I was describing that says that people are sort of slow to adjust. And so when you greatly increase agricultural productivity, at first that's going to increase wages, but not increase population very much. But over time, people should move in or fewer people should move out. And that's going to push down wages by increasing labor supply. And so what we should expect is that canals that were built very recently should have bigger effects on wages than they should have on population density. Canals that were built a long time ago should have bigger effects on population density, but smaller effects on wages. And so we're using the timing of these canal construction to try to test that hypothesis. And I may have some results for that very soon. The second, as I said, is really understanding urbanization. It may be that canals are in fact facilitating structural change, are facilitating movement out of agriculture. It's just not happening in the canal treatment villages themselves. It's happening somewhere else. And we're going to test this by looking at all of these towns and see whether they grow faster when canals get built nearby. And then finally, we want to really nail this balance issue. I showed you that we have balance on ruggedness. I showed you that we have balance on distances to cities and rivers and on rainfall. But we really want to be able to see directly measured data for villages before a lot of these canals were built and see whether the treatment villages below canals and the control villages nearby but above canals did actually look the same on average back in 1951 before they got the canals in the first place. So that's the paper. Thanks so much for your time. I was hoping to leave a few minutes for discussion at the end, and for once, it actually seemed to work out. So looking forward to your questions.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. So there are a couple of questions. So Abhishek Tripathi, what he's asking is, does your research observe something on rural indebtedness? Downhill villages are expected to engage more with the formal financial sector and perhaps be less indebted.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting hypothesis. We do not observe. I was saying that these censuses ask very few questions, and this is rural indebtedness is definitely something of interest to many of us, but it's not on the top 20 list of sort of questions that the SECC asks when they're trying to figure out which households are poor and in need of social protection and which ones don't. So the best that we could do, it's a really interesting question. I think we could actually look in the population census, and there is a variable on do you have a bank account? And so we can at least provide a little bit of evidence in this direction by looking at engagement with the formal financial sector as you suggest.
Okay, next we have Vishal. Vishal is asking, a canal might result in productivity gains due to increase in labor intensity in more growing seasons. So by the Bustos paper, we should expect manufacturing sector to not grow much in such areas. Why wasn't that the null hypothesis?
Yeah, so I think that's a good point, and that could definitely be part of what's going on here. The sort of dominant idea in the sort of agriculture-led development literature is that agricultural productivity gains are going to generate a bunch of capital and labor that wouldn't kind of be free otherwise. They could be invested or reallocated to these other sectors, as well as demand, as I mentioned earlier. I think, I guess I would take your question and say, I think that may very well be a part of what's happening here. That when you start to pay higher wages, when you start to have more agricultural productivity, you probably have higher land values, and that's increasing the factor costs for any other sector of the economy. And so it's going to be harder rather than easier to move into those other sectors when you've basically created more competition for the inputs that they also are looking for. So, it's the challenge here is that it's hard to test these more subtle theories. We do see increases in productivity. One idea, I guess, would be we might be able to divide up our sample into areas where we see increases in rugby productivity. We might be able to divide up our sample into areas that do see big gains in rugby productivity and those that don't, and maybe see whether they have differential spillovers into the non-agricultural economy.
Okay, so next we have Tusharika. So she is asking the following. I was wondering if we can measure the ROI of canals on agricultural productivity versus other measures like afforestation or promoting rainwater harvesting, especially since correlation of coefficient across is less than 0.1 for most of the parameters that we have studied.
Yeah, so that's a really great question. I should have been clear about this at the beginning, the first one on the ROI of canals, which is, fundamentally the way we wrote this paper is trying to study this age-old question about spillovers from agriculture to non-agriculture more than we're actually trying to estimate the precise impact of what canals are doing in these places. And part of the reason for that is that our identification strategy, which is comparing these uphill to downhill villages, isn't exactly kind of the cleanest test of 100% canal versus no canal, right? Because the villages that are just downhill, are they getting more or less water than the average canal village? Are the villages that are just uphill, are they really getting no canal benefits? I mean, people have argued that one of the things that India's very poorly maintained and leaky irrigation canals do is actually recharge the groundwater table. And so like they're having these very diffuse benefits by basically delivering a lot of water very indirectly through the groundwater table, through aquifers and pumps to all of these other villages, right? So we can't exactly say like the villages that are just downhill are getting full canal treatment and the villages just uphill are getting zero canal treatment. If we were, then we could try to say, look, this is exactly the full impact of canals. We're probably underestimating the overall impact of canals because probably the villages just uphill are getting some of the benefits through pumping directly from the canals or pumping from groundwater or whatever. So that's one challenge to estimating the ROI. The second one is that we don't directly observe, like say, rupee wages or something like that, or total GDP of these villages, which is exactly what you would want to measure to calculate that ROI. And the third is that the data on the actual spending on canals is really bad as well. So basically everything that you would want to estimate something like ROI, we don't have. And frankly, that's something that, a challenge I faced in my research on rural roads and on other things like that, which is just, you don't have the sort of the data required to do such a thing. On your other questions of afforestation or promoting rainwater harvesting, no to the rainwater harvesting, maybe to the afforestation. So what we find is a slight increase in the share of the village that is under cultivation. So that basically kind of says there's probably going to be a little bit of deforestation as the result of these canals, because there's now like a bit, basically like in general, land is kind of either agriculture or it has trees on it. I know that's a slight oversimplification, but like in rural India, that's not a bad one. So my guess would be that maybe we're seeing a slight deforestation. I guess that we could add that as another result. We have the data, so we may as well do that. So thanks for that suggestion.
Okay, so next we have Kirti Vardhan. Kirti Vardhan.
Yeah. Hi, Sam. So something about the manufacturing results. So I was just wondering if you looked at analyzing villages with different infrastructure abilities and how they sort of performed with regards to manufacturing employment. Because despite, let's say two similar villages, both of them which do get the canal water, but they have very different road connectivity, very different telecom or whatever infrastructure aspects we're looking at. That can be an important determinant in understanding how manufacturing may rise in one village and not. Because I mean,
Yeah.
most of the manufacturing that we're looking at must be small scale, small markets. I mean, maybe small scale industries. So having maybe a road or something gives them the access to probably get more people on board and maybe dream of setting up something bigger. So maybe that is something that you might have looked at.
Yeah, so we're doing a bunch of those cuts. We're not finding a whole lot right now. This has been a sort of holy grail of mine for a while, since my work on rural roads and some other work that we have on like linkages between rural and urban areas. I'm really interested in what are the potentially complex set of complementary investments and conditions that facilitate rural economic growth, right? And I think that my research on roads, this stuff on canals is kind of showing that like actually you can make really massive infrastructural investments that cost just tons of money that don't actually have very big impacts on average on a wide range of economic outcomes. And in the roads work, I was really hoping to kind of see the nice thing about studying things in India is that you have 600,000 villages to analyze. Maybe it's on average that roads don't have much of an effect on living standards in these villages, but actually if the road is paired with electricity and is paired with adequate levels of human capital and whatever else, then maybe it will facilitate more growth, more rising wages, whatever, all the good stuff that we care about. In fact, we cut it 1,000 different ways. I was desperately trying to write that paper, and I basically ended up writing a null result paper there because I just couldn't find any of these interactions that actually predicted like really positive effects of the roads. The same is kind of happening here. I haven't showed you absolutely everything that we've done, but believe me, we've run a lot of different specifications with a lot of different cuts on a lot of different types of infrastructure and education levels and all kinds of stuff, and we're really not finding much. And I have to admit, and this is, it's not like we're exactly proving this here, but if you look at the economic history of pretty much every rich country in the world, economic growth has largely been a process of urbanization. So many people get out of agriculture. Basically, the world used to be almost entirely agricultural. And then growth starts happening. Growth starts happening in the cities. It starts happening in the towns. And that's where manufacturing can be productive because they have thick labor markets. A village, even if it has electricity and a road and a school, is never going to be a thick labor market with all of the different types of workers and suppliers and buyers that firms need to be really productive. I mean, I grew up in a rural area in the United States, and believe me, we have great roads and we have great schools and we have great electricity and we have great everything. And every single one of my classmates moved out of town. Not a single person that I was close with stayed in the town because there are just no opportunities there. All the opportunities, this is in Western Massachusetts, all the opportunities are in Boston or New York or New Haven or the cities. And so I think, India is going through this process very slowly, in many ways more slowly than a lot of people expect and hope for. And I think a lot of that is due to a lot of urban dysfunction that makes urban areas much less sort of appealing and productive places than they could potentially be, which is why I'm trying to steer some of my new research towards making cities more productive rather than understanding what drives rural growth. But that's my broad model of the world, and I think that the fact that we're having trouble finding results, even in the interactions, even in another massive kind of rural infrastructure program, I think just kind of points a bit more towards that model of the world.
Yeah. Thanks.
Right. So Abhishek Rajan has a question. So what he's pointing is one of the key results is that canal irrigation has led to increase in irrigation and productivity. So from what he understands, we are comparing villages with access to canal versus with access to no canal. I think you talked about it. Does villages with no canal means they practice rainfed agriculture? Does the study take into account other sources of irrigation? Conjunctive use of groundwater and surface water is also a common practice among the farming communities. How does the study take that into account?
Yeah, so this is a great question. Let me just say, this is gonna be the last question because I need to get some sleep, and I have a call in less than 8 hours that I have to get up for, unfortunately. This is the first time that I'm actually giving like a midnight talk and then an early morning call to India again. I just need to reverse my schedule and get on your guys' schedule, I think. This is a great question. I should have been clear about this at the beginning. So look, there are many different forms of irrigation in India. Canal and groundwater are the two largest. Groundwater irrigation is basically practiced all over the place. It's practiced in canal villages, it's practiced in non-canal villages. And so absolutely, farmers have other options here and they're taking advantage of them. And so in some sense, to have the most perfect natural experiment with the most statistical power, we would have villages that are getting all the irrigation that they want in treatment villages and like no irrigation in the control villages. That would be like the most extreme experiment that we could potentially ever imagine. But again, I'm not in control of anything, nor would I ever want to deny people access to irrigation that can help them, their lives and their farms. So instead, what we have to do is try to look for these sort of discontinuous jumps in agricultural productivity. And that's basically coming from the fact that you have control villages that practice a bunch of tube well irrigation, treatment villages that practice a bunch of tube well irrigation, and a whole lot more canal irrigation. And so they both have, actually in these areas, they both have both. But the villages that we're calling treatment villages have a bunch more, particularly of the canal irrigation. So there are other studies by Sheetal Sekri and others, really nice work that try to estimate the impacts of tube well irrigation on all kinds of economic outcomes. And what they do is they try to take advantage of like basically underground hydrogeology that lends itself more to tube well irrigation in some places than others. That can be because in some places the water table is a lot deeper than in others and the pumps only have so much power to bring up water from that deep. Sometimes it's because like different types of hydrogeology just really don't make tube wells feasible at all or make them very easy. So there's a bunch of research out there on that. Basically, what the results I showed relatively early on in this presentation show is that tube well irrigation is pretty similar in treatment and control villages. And then the treatment is basically getting a whole bunch of canal water on top of that.
Okay, great. So what we can do is if people have more questions, they can either share it with me or Abhishek Shah. And then we may send those list of questions to you, and whenever you have time, maybe you can respond to them.
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay.
Absolutely. Don't hesitate to reach out.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Sam, for for this excellent presentation and sort of also taking some time out to talk about the data as well. I hope those who are researching will be able to make most of it. Thank you so much, and have a good night.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate the invitation. Take care. Have a good day. Bye.